So before jumping into the analytical pieces of this, I just want to start by briefly summarizing the odd story within the text. Christopher McCandless, born into a well-to-do family residing in Alexandria, Virginia, attended Woodson High School and attained his undergraduate from Emory University. He then left his family and friends skeptical when he decided to disappear from the map. The text logs his journey from the East Coast all the way through the Midwest to California, down to Mexico, back to the Midwest, and then finally up to Alaska. Author Jon Krakauer records McCandless' social experiences that he had along the way from the moment he drove his yellow Datsun across the country to the moment when he was found dead and decomposing on September 6, 1992, inside a 1946 International Harvester bus on Stampede Trail in North Denali National Park. His cause of death was suspected to be starvation or possibly poisoning. So the burning question remains, why did McCandless choose this life when it seemed he had everything in front of him? In the latter half of the text, a bias can be easily detected when Krakauer employs a story about how he, as a young man, ice-hooked his way to the summit of the Stikine ice cap in Alaska's dangerous Devil's Thumb almost 20 years earlier. He narrates the story of his father and easily compares himself to McCandless in the sense that they both had paternal figures whom they were not close with. He notes, quote, "I believe that we were similarly affected by the skewed relationships we had with our fathers," end quote. It becomes clear that Krakauer is able to relate to McCandless and his father's relationship. He can empathize with McCandless and later infers that he and McCandless both knew death as an abstract concept they were both enticed to, quote, "steal up to the edge of doom and peer over the brink," end quote, as Krakauer puts it. This further demonstrates that both Krakauer and McCandless had similar minds, and it is understandable how Krakauer may lean toward McCandless' side and afford him some leeway in relation to his decisions and further life choices. Pertaining to audience, it becomes quite clear who Krakauer is striving to enlighten as the text progresses. After reciting a rather lengthy anecdote pertaining to his personal experience in climbing Devil's Thumb, a treacherous mountain in Alaska, and narrowly escaping death, as well as narrating his malicious experience with his father, he compares himself to McCandless and notes, quote, "If I had not returned, people would have been quick to say of me, as they now say of him, that I had a death wish," end quote. He then states, quote, "That was very far from a death wish," end quote, referring to both himself and McCandless. He is blatantly reaching out to an audience that is skeptical and unsavory in the sense that they have very little remorse for McCandless. This respective audience believes he is selfish and ill-advised and does indeed seek a death wish. Krakauer also cites a multitude of opinions that warrant this same audience identified earlier. Opinions such as Alex, which is Chris's pseudonym, is a nut in my book, and, quote, "McCandless had already gone over the edge and just happened to hit bottom in Alaska," end quote. The myriad of quoted opinions further afford that the audience Krakauer is reaching out to is immensely skeptical of McCandless and feels no sympathy for him. This perfectly bridges to our next point, which is, why does Krakauer write the text, and why does he go against the grain of opinions relating to McCandless and his choices?
For subject, Krakauer uses the interviews and the dialogue between McCandless and his family to make his point of view clear. Acknowledging both negative and positive opinions of McCandless allows a critical response received from the readers to regress because of the transparency of Krakauer's position. Because Krakauer wants to tell McCandless' story from an innocent point of view, he includes the interviews to communicate McCandless' apparent struggles and hardships that drove him to his different path. By doing this, Krakauer implies the greater social and personal values most important to McCandless, giving the audience a clear-cut analysis between how McCandless has handled his family matters and why it may have been reasonable as to how he acted during his life. Now, before we dive right into what Krakauer's main motives are all about, we need to first examine why he initiates his own perspective through specific parts of the text where he uses descriptions, as well as sections where he explicitly makes its own stance against potential audiences through first-hand sources. First, Krakauer really invests in how he portrays certain situations by using recurring techniques with sentence structure, giving the audience a personal, genuine look as to what exactly the author wants the audience to read. An example would be, quote, "There's one grocery in town, one bank, a single gas station, a lone bar, the cabaret," end quote. Not exactly the kind of sentence an author would use to describe a beautiful place. Now keep in mind, this is part of the very first chapter, and this sentence structure, be it repetition to elaborate attention to detail, restates itself throughout the entirety of the book. With that in mind, it's clear that Krakauer aims to provide an honest retelling of Chris McCandless' story, by doing so with as much detail as possible. So wait, if Krakauer's goal is to provide a truthful process concerning McCandless, why exactly does Krakauer include the short stories and interviews of all the people McCandless has encountered throughout his journey? Aren't the individuals who have met McCandless entitled to their own opinions, regardless if they are accurate to McCandless? Now that's exactly the point. Krakauer doesn't care if people say that McCandless was crazy or not. What matters to Krakauer is the perspective he delivers to the audience. The book is constructed in reverse order, meaning that McCandless' journey from his normal home to the rugged outskirts of Alaska has no set order of events. Rather, it shows events within the timeline to provide the audience with McCandless' perspective on how he wanted to live his life. This clearly bridges Krakauer's main opinion on how McCandless to the perspective the audience receives, through the advances and setbacks of McCandless. Krakauer provides essential hints towards the overall tone of the book, complementing his reserved yet supportive outlook on McCandless. For example, quote, "Although the tone of the journal, written in the third person in a stilted, self-conscious voice, often veers towards melodrama, the available evidence indicates that McCandless did not misrepresent the facts. Telling the truth was a credo he took seriously." End quote. Krakauer embeds this description of a personal journal that McCandless wrote to provide genuine evidence as to how McCandless went about his journey. Although this text mainly serves as background, it also applies to the audience by showing them Krakauer's own evaluation of McCandless' attitude, as well as stating pure fact through hard evidence from McCandless himself.
In terms of occasion, Into the Wild was published in the mid-90s, and to be more specific, 1996. Certain events surrounding this time period seem to fit in perfectly with the man vs. nature essence of Into the Wild. An avalanche in Iceland killed 14 people, and the infamous Hanshin earthquake in Japan left around 6,000 people dead and more than 300,000 people displaced. Another earthquake took place on a Russian island, killing about 2,000 people. In addition, Steve Fossett, an American businessman, was the first man ever to make a solo flight across the Pacific Ocean using a large balloon in February 1995. However, like Chris, Fossett met a cruel end, disappearing in a light aircraft over the Great Basin Desert between Nevada and California. His body was later found in the form of 2 large bones. The most notable event in terms of influence on Krakauer would be the 1996 Everest disaster. Mount Everest is known to claim victims with its harsh conditions, but 1996 would set a record at the time with over 12 fatalities within a single month. With TV reaching peak audience numbers and the internet improving at a rapid pace, almost anyone can hear and learn about these stories. It's safe to assume that a combination of all these events and factors influenced Krakauer to revisit and elaborate upon Chris's story in the original article he wrote about him.
To give some author background, Jon Krakauer is the author of 8 books and has received an Academy Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. The author has a very good way of describing situations in the story that makes it much easier for the reader to picture and imagine scenes in the story. He actually started mountain climbing at the age of 8 with his father. He graduated from Hampshire College in 1976, and in 1977 he attempted the Devil's Thumb in southeastern Alaska, a sheer ice-dappled mountain. The author originally wrote this book as a long-term article published in Outside magazine. Some particular topics that are described in the book are that throughout college, Chris and his parents' relationship began to disappear. After graduating, Chris had enough and dropped everything and began to hike in the West. He even sold his car and burned all the money in his wallet and even changed his name. He traveled all over the West Coast around California, Arizona, and even a little in Mexico. He never had a lot of money and never stayed in one place for very long. He met many people who helped him along the way, but he never got close enough to even call them as friends. Chris had gone all over the West Coast, but the whole time he had one place that he wanted to end up in, Alaska. As he made his way, there were many truckers that would pick him up and other generous people. They all seemed to like Chris, but they knew he was different. A man who actually drove Chris the rest of the way to Alaska told him that the area he was going to was dangerous and full of grizzlies. Chris did not care, and he began to hike into the wilderness. Chris actually came across a broken down bus and made a camp there. Soon after, he would die of starvation and his body would be found 2 weeks later. Some social topics that are discussed in the text is that education is very important and many people do not understand how much it helps. Chris was very smart, but he didn't like school and never wanted to pursue college or even a real job. Chris's story is a great example of how everyone should not take school for granted, and even if you don't like it, it is extremely important for your future. Trying in school and going to college will help you get a real job that will provide for yourself and your family. Because of Chris's ignorance, he couldn't even provide for himself. Even if he found love in what he was doing, there was no way he wanted his life to end so soon because of his choices, which resulted in what happened. We should take advantage of our education and opportunities and do what is best for us. Chris never liked being told what he would want to do, even as a little kid. He loved people, but in a different way. Him and his parents' relationship was not good at all. They all had different views on everything, and they wanted him to do things a certain way. He never wanted to go to college, but he was talked into it by his parents. After college, he had enough of his family and cut off all communication with them and everyone else he knew. 2 years later, after living on his own, he would actually die of starvation.